Today we're going to make this leather and canvas minimalist wallet. My friend Matty has some gray canvas and leather accessories and is a huge fan of the aesthetic, to say the least. To complete the look, he asked me to make him a minimalist wallet in that style. After a couple weeks of texting ideas back and forth, we finally came up with this sleek, double-sided design. It has 3 crisscrossing pockets on each side and a large cash pocket in the middle. I made a paper mock-up of one side and then cut it apart to use as a template. I decided to use the canvas for the middle pocket on each side. This shows just a sliver of gray and allows the canvas to be an accent without being overpowering. All of the leather in this wallet is 1 to 2 ounce veg tan. I used my rotary cutter against a straight edge to cut out 2 of each piece. I found this piece of gray canvas at my local leather and sewing supply store. It has a glossy waterproof coating on one side, and I turned that side inwards. I cut out 2 canvas pockets, 1 for each side. With all the pieces cut out, I was ready to add a bit of personalization. Matty asked for 2 small carvings on the wallet, a feather on one side and his initials MC on the other. I did some very similar carvings last year for Matty when he commissioned me to make him this Oreo cookie keychain, as I like to call it. What can I say? The man knows his style. I wet one of the front pockets, allowed it to partially dry, and then ran a pencil over my tracing to emboss it into the leather. The embossing doesn't tend to show up very well on this thin leather, but I was able to see it just enough to follow with my swivel knife. I repeated this process to carve the feather on the other front pocket. After doing the carvings, I was ready to dye the leather. I wanted to match the color to Matty's existing accessories, so I diluted some chocolate and light brown leather dye with rubbing alcohol until I got just the right shade. I dyed the back of each piece first, in case any dye soaked through the thin leather. My thinking was when I dyed the fronts, I could cover up any spots where dye soaked through. What I didn't realize was the solvent actually soaked through separately from the dye itself. This ended up giving me some weird splotching on the fronts of the pieces that I couldn't cover up no matter how many coats of dye I applied, and this whole strategy basically backfired. I think I should have waited longer between applying coats to the backs so that the leather would never get wet enough for dye to soak through to the other side. But if you have any other tips on dyeing thin leather, let me know in the comments below. In the end, the stacked pocket layout ended up hiding most of the blotchiness. I rotated the pieces in between coats, which makes it easier to apply the dye in every direction, especially when you can only work from one side of the table. After applying the final coat, I rubbed each piece with a rag to remove any dye that was left on the surface. I used the back of a butter knife against a straight edge to emboss a subtle accent line along the top of each pocket. The leather was still a bit damp from the dye, so I didn't have to wet it for the impression to stay. You can see the worst of the blotching here, which luckily ended up getting covered by the other pockets. I oiled the leather with neatsfoot oil and let it set for half a day. Then, I finished the pieces with a couple coats of carnauba cream. This is a natural wax-based conditioner that's super easy to apply. You just wipe it on, allow to dry, and buff with a soft cloth. The carnauba cream also mellowed out the blotchy areas and gave the leather a more uniform sheen. Before I could move on to assembling the wallet, I needed to finish the top edge of each pocket, since it would be really tricky to get at these edges once the wallet is put together. Because this leather is so thin, I only beveled the outer side of these edges. My number 2 edge beveler is probably a bit too aggressive for 1 to 2 ounce leather, and I had to be really careful that I didn't bevel too deep. I dyed the edges, re-wet them with water, and gave them a light burnishing. Finally, it was time to assemble all 8 pieces into a functioning wallet. I worked my way outwards from the 2 inner rectangles and attached the pieces together with contact cement. Whenever I make a wallet, notebook cover, or anything else that has pockets, I make sure to keep the contact cement to a really thin strip along the edge. This is so I don't accidentally make the pockets too small, which can be really annoying when you're in a rush to take out your credit card. I do make sure that the strip is wide enough that I have some wiggle room to trim the edges flush without exposing an uncemented edge. At the end of the day, the real strength will come from stitching the pieces together. As far as I'm concerned, the contact cement is just to keep the pieces lined up and create a solid edge without gaps. I always make sure to widen the strip of contact cement on the corners because I'll later trim these away to form a round over. I couldn't really burnish the top edges of the canvas pockets like I did for the leather ones, but I did want to add some polish to these edges before attaching them to the wallet. So I used a flame to carefully burn off the little frizzies and sort of melt the loose ends into a more solid edge. When I mark the areas for contact cement, I always put the mark slightly under the overlapping piece so that I don't have an exposed blotch of contact cement. This does mean that the top corners of the pockets will be a little flappy, and if stitching and burnishing don't bring them together, I can always go in with a toothpick and add a little dot of contact cement where it's needed. Once I had all 8 pieces stacked up, I was left with an ugly, uneven edge. But this was no problem since I had made an oversized template and had plenty of wiggle room to trim these edges flush. I used a razor blade to add a chamfer to the 2 bottom corners and then smooth them into a roundover with some 120 grit sandpaper. Once the edges were smooth and uniform, I added a bevel to both sides. I also ran a flame along the canvas edges to melt the loose threads into a cohesive edge. When I dyed the edges, I was super careful around the canvas pockets. Thankfully, my hands were steady and dye only went where it was supposed to. I used the good old back of a butter knife against a ruler trick to create a line around the border of the wallet. This gave me a guideline to follow when I punched the stitching holes with my diamond chisels. I used my scratch awl to make the stitching holes in the corners. This gives you a circular hole rather than the diamond-shaped hole made by the stitching chisels and lets you get a nice 90-degree bend in the stitch line. I knew I wanted to add a wraparound stitching detail near the top of the wallet, so I burnished just this little section of the edge before moving on to stitching. I saddle stitched the wallet together with woven waxed thread in this really cool reddish brown color. I was really happy with how well this thread matched the leather. The final step of this project was burnishing the edges until they were smooth and shiny. If you've ever made something, you know how easy it can be to focus on your mistakes. I'll be honest, that splotchy dye job really got me down, and I had a hard time looking past it. But as this project progressed and the wallet started to take shape, that single imperfection started to matter less and less. And by the time I went to the park to take these finishing shots, I was so amped with how this wallet turned out. I can see why Matty is obsessed with the gray canvas and brown leather aesthetic. It's such a beautiful complementary combination of texture and color. And I probably would never have worked with this combination if he hadn't texted me about how much he needs more gray canvas and leather in his life. So shout out to those awesome friends like Matty who get us out of our comfort zones and go out of their way to support us. Thanks for watching and have a great day.